Ukraine rejects and condemns ultimatums and blackmail from Hungary and Slovakia. This was the response of the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to statements by the governments of Viktor Orban and Robert Fico, who are threatening to halt electricity exports if the supply of Russian fuel through the Druzhba oil pipeline is not restored. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs called such threats provocative and unfounded, stating that they jeopardize the energy security of the entire region. Ukraine, for its part, is in constant contact with representatives of the European Commission regarding the damage to energy infrastructure caused by daily Russian strikes. And it has already proposed alternative ways to resolve the issue of supplying non-Russian oil to these countries. They also added that they are calling on the governments of Hungary and Slovakia to engage in constructive dialogue and that ultimatums should be sent to the Kremlin, not to Kyiv. Are Hungary and Slovakia really that dependent on Russian oil, and specifically on this oil pipeline? Ivan Ausa, chief consultant at the Center for Foreign Policy Studies of the National Institute for Strategic Studies and PhD in economics, will discuss this and more. Mr. Ivan, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander, and greetings to everyone watching us.
So Hungary and Slovakia have moved on to direct threats. As we can see, Orban is blocking a 90 billion euro loan. Fico is threatening to stop electricity exports if oil does not appear in the Druzhba pipeline eventually. What do you think? How capable are they of actually carrying out these threats? I mean, will the European Union just stand by and watch this happen?
First of all, Mr. Alexander, let me remind you that when it comes to the supply of goods, which is foreign trade, there are no individual EU countries involved. There is a single European Union. So the decision to supply or not to supply products, this is a decision made at the level of the European Commission, not by the government of any specific European Union country. So here, if Hungary or Slovakia, if they refuse to do this, they will only create problems for themselves in their dialogue with Brussels, which of course does not take such steps. Moreover, let me remind you that the European Union has already made a decision that they will refuse starting from January 1st, 2028, from any Russian hydrocarbons. That is, in fact, by not supplying Russian hydrocarbons to EU countries such as Hungary and Slovakia, Ukraine is helping to implement the decision of the European Commission. This is very important, so that the European Commission is present in this dialogue. In addition to that, if they genuinely desire to incorporate the Russian language as for electrical and energy-related goods, or simply energy goods such as crude oil and natural gas, then here as well, it cannot be said that they cannot receive them, simply because of the current position of Ukraine. Because I would like to remind you that just last year, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was telling both Slovakia and Hungary, if you want to have Russian resources, please, there is the Southern Stream, where Russia supplies Turkey, and then Turkey supplies them accordingly to Bulgaria, and then from Bulgaria to Serbia, and through Serbia they go to Hungary. So they can also receive it this way. And when Hungary or Slovakia say that it is expensive, it means that the issue is not that they can't get what they want, but that they want to get it at lower prices. But that's a different story, because no one is depriving them of this opportunity. They'll just have to pay more if, of course, they want to buy specifically Russian resources. If they still choose to move along the path of rejecting Russian hydrocarbons, the question becomes a different one. Where can they find an alternative to Russia? In principle, Turkey has long been building an energy hub for itself, attracting Azerbaijani resources there, and they can also serve as a substitute in Slovakia and Hungary. Russian resources, in fact, in Slovakia as well, I remind you, there are agreements with Azerbaijan. And Mr. Fico even flew to Baku last year to talk with Aliyev. So it cannot be said that there is no alternative to Russian supplies. There are Azerbaijani supplies, plus, again, Turkey. If it is interested in having goods sanctioned pass through its territory, it can put pressure on the al-Assad regime. In Syria, in order to speed up the construction of a gas pipeline from Qatar to Turkey, as well as oil pipelines from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to Turkey, so that without a doubt it will be able to fully replace Russian oil and gas on the European market. And to be honest, it's already time. Since the government in Syria has changed, it's long overdue to do this.
So am I correct in understanding that the stoppage of oil transit, specifically through the Druzhba oil pipeline, actually does not have as much of an impact on the economies of Hungary and Slovakia as their officials claim? So when we hear Sijarto say that this is a catastrophe, that their refineries will go bankrupt, how would you assess the impact on their economy in this regard?
I see this purely as political statements. In other words, they have alternative options on the table. Even regarding Russian resources, Ukraine is not talking about Russian resources. Ukraine is saying, let's consider alternatives, but for that, I can say they can still receive Russian resources. The only thing is that they would have to pay the most by routing it through Turkey. And here it turns out that they are not interested in these resources. They just want to pay as little as possible. And so they are rejecting the proposals regarding Turkey. Well, we'll see, because in principle, I don't see any problems for them with such steps. And again, I would like to remind you of the European Commission's decision to refuse Russian resources. Ukraine is fully, as they say, working in line with the decisions of the European Commission. And
is it only about the lower price here? Is it a matter of the cost of Russian oil? Or is there also a factor here such as the personal, perhaps, interest of Fico and Orban? Because they seem to be defending Russian oil a bit too persistently. Aren't they somehow personally interested in this?
undoubtedly, it gives the impression that, first and foremost, they are fulfilling a contract with Moscow. As I mentioned with Syria, why was it impossible to build oil pipelines, especially a gas pipeline from Qatar to Turkey and then to Europe? It was because Bashar Assad, in my opinion, was receiving instructions from Russia in exchange for guarantees that, in a difficult situation, they would, as they say, save him, which, by the way, Russia did. In other words, they helped Assad escape. To Moscow, yes. So it's quite possible that certain similar agreements exist between Office and Orban with the Russian authorities as well. And here again, I always recall the book by the new Nobel laureate in economics, Joseph Stiglitz, from as far back as 2001, in which he wrote a very interesting section about the corruption of certain officials, specifically in the IMF, when they are offered certain positions in other companies in exchange for making decisions in favor of those companies. There is already an example in European political history, Gerhard Schröder, who, after he stopped being the Chancellor of Germany, received a lucrative position from Russia. Now, I do not rule out that there are certain agreements with Russia, with Orban and Fico. Again, I wasn't there to witness it myself, but the way they behave leads one to such thoughts.